This episode of America Fog of War is brought to you by Civil War Trails. Civil War Trails is the world's largest open-air museum, with over 1,300 sites to explore across 6 states. Drive the Gettysburg Campaign turn by turn, paddle past Frederick Douglass's birthplace, or hike to remote artillery positions. Follow Civil War Trails and create some history of your own. Visit civilwartrails.org to request a brochure today. If this is your first time listening to the show, you should know that this is the 4th episode of our season covering the U.S. Civil War. If you like starting a story from the beginning, I'd recommend listening to episode 1 before continuing with this episode. If you don't mind jumping right in the middle of a story, then by all means, thanks for joining us. Now, on with the show. I am Colby Sumner, and this is America Fog of War.
Pride of our nation. This day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of...
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. In the field, the people have not these buildings now. Well, hear all of it.
We're told that on his body was found a diary. Under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure.
I've been captivated by warfare, and that's everything with warfare. The history of war, the people that fought them, the reasons they began, and why they were either won or lost, for as long as I can remember. And if I were to boil what it is about war that has kept my interest so high for so long, down to a core reason, beyond the battlefield tactics and the grand strategies, it's that war may be the most horrific experience human beings have the potential to live through. It's the worst of what humanity has to offer, and that's been the case from antiquity to the present. But if you read about or study war, it doesn't matter the era you choose or which militaries a particular war showcases. You will find example after example of people in the midst of hell on earth display these qualities that are the very best of humanity. On any battlefield, past or present, among the countless individual tragedies and heartbreaks, you will find just as many acts of bravery, resolve, and sacrifice. That extreme spectrum of human experience is something almost exclusively seen as a result of war. That's not to say that the worst or best of humanity isn't seen outside the realm of combat, but it's seeing both ends of that spectrum originate from the same experience that makes warfare so unique, in my opinion, at least. And there are times that entire groups of people, whether an army, a nation, or a group of nations, will exhibit those same qualities that we see on the individual level, both the good ones and the bad. After its defeat at First Manassas, the Union as a nation begins to exhibit a quality in this manner. Instead of crumbling into fear and giving up the war, the Union collectively takes on this iron will, a refusal of defeat no matter how bad things got, like a resolve to take the best shots the Confederacy was capable of, then hit back harder. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book Team of Rivals, quotes an article from the New York Times printed shortly after the First Battle of Manassas that talks about the Norse manifestation of this iron will. And it says this, quote, "The spirit of the people is now thoroughly aroused, and, what is equally important, it has been chastened and moderated by the stern lessons of experience." End quote. That's quite an outlook for a populace to take after losing the first battle in a war they originally thought would be over by this point. And, truth be told, the Union was going to need as much of that quality as they could muster to win a victory over the Confederacy. Just based off their war aims alone, it's clear the Union faces a steeper uphill battle than the South does. You see, for the North to win the war, they would have to invade the South and conquer it. The South, on the other hand, didn't have to conquer the North, and although they didn't have to invade the North either. They just had to keep the North from winning. Essentially, they had to stay alive. They had to outlast the Union and wait for one of two things to happen, either for the North's population to lose its will to fight, or for a European power to enter the war on behalf of the Confederacy. The unfortunate reality for the South was the likelihood that England or any other European nation would enter the war as their ally was far less likely than what they thought it was. And that's because support for either the North or the South among the European ruling class was a mixed bag of goodies. If we look at England, for example, they most definitely could have benefited from a weakened United States. And there were many British political leaders at that time that desired that exact outcome. But at the same time, there were other British leaders who were worried about the impact a Southern victory would have had on the British public. Europe had experienced the most widespread revolutionary wave in its history just 12 years earlier. That's the Revolution of 1848. And the last thing any politician or monarch wanted was for a Confederate victory to inspire more revolution in Europe. But the reason the South felt so confident in a European intervention, at least during those early years of the war, was because of the King Cotton theory. See, at this point of the 19th century, 4/5 of Britain's cotton supply came from the southern United States. And with the Union blockading the southern coastline, effectively cutting Britain off from that source of cotton, its main source of cotton, Confederate leaders believed that the British public would experience the extremely high inflation that results from having high demand and almost no supply. And because of that, the British public would put pressure on the ruling class and eventually force England into the war on the side of the Confederacy to put an end to it. Or, at the very least, they believed Britain would eventually have to break the Norse blockade of southern ports to supply the overwhelming demand for cotton back in Europe. What the Confederate leaders didn't anticipate, though, was England having a surplus of cotton built up from the years leading up to the war. They had also started developing alternative sources for cotton in places like India and Egypt. So, although in the very early stages of the war, England would feel the effects of the Union blockade, in the grand scheme of things, it was very minimal and short-lived. A few years into the war, those alternative sources would be filling the void Southern cotton had left, and England would really have no reason to break the Union blockade. But at this point in the story, the concern over European relations and whether or not Britain would enter the war was still a major concern for both the North as well as the South. And when Britain proclaimed its neutrality in May of 1861, Northern concern over European intervention rose drastically. And I know that there's many of you out there thinking, hey, isn't a neutral England good for the Union? And the answer to that is yes. If that neutrality lasts the remainder of the war, it's exactly what the Union wants. But the more immediate concern for the Union was Britain's proclamation of neutrality granted belligerent status to the Confederacy. Since the day South Carolina seceded from the Union, Lincoln had been claiming the entire time that the Confederacy wasn't a belligerent nation-state, that seceding from the Union wasn't something a state could legally or constitutionally do in the first place. On top of that, the South's new belligerent status also gives them the legal ability to take out loans with and purchase supplies from neutral nations. And that's a big plus for the Confederacy. Now, I know they have their ports blockaded, but this is early on. That blockade is not entirely as effective as it needs to be. And eventually those blockade runners will get very effective at what they do. Now, this all leads us to November of 1861, where this question of European intervention and how much England will be involved in this war really comes to a boiling point. There is a Union warship that is going to stop a British vessel that's in the Caribbean. It's called the Trent. The reason they stopped that ship is just to, ensure that supplies or personnel from the Confederacy aren't leaving the Confederacy. And on board, they find two Confederate commissioners who are traveling to speak with the governments of England and France to plead the Confederacy's case. The Union warship commander will arrest those two Confederate commissioners and eventually have them sent to a prison in Boston. And he'll let the Trent go on its way back to England. When the Trent finally made it back to England, the commander of the ship notifies the British authorities of what had happened to the two commissioners. The British authorities, when they hear this news, are enraged. They were so upset, in fact, that the incident almost bypasses both King Cotton and the South's belligerent status as the reason why England would enter the war. England will even begin mobilizing troops and ships for an expedition to the U.S. So it's getting pretty serious. But knowing what a disaster that would be for the Union, England entering the war on the side of the Confederacy, Lincoln decides to release those two Confederate commissioners. And he'll be quoted as saying to his cabinet and his staff, "Gentlemen, one war at a time." Lincoln couldn't afford the addition of another problem on top of all the problems he already had on his list. And the problem at the top of that list was finding another commander to put in charge of the army that fought at First Manassas. McDowell and Patterson both will be relieved of their command over their respective armies from that First Manassas campaign. And both of their former commands will be consolidated with the departments of Washington and of Pennsylvania to form what will be considered the principal Union Army in the Eastern Theater for the remainder of the war. This is the Union Field Army that makes famous battles with names like Antietam and Gettysburg. This field army has more junior officers that will, over the course of the next 4 years, ascend the ranks to become incredible combat leaders than any other field army in U.S. history. This field army is going to be called the Army of the Potomac. And the man that Lincoln has picked to put in command of this army is a meteoric success at everything he does. I mean, just listen to his resume. He is a West Point graduate and a veteran of the Mexican-American War, who, after the war, will leave the Army and work his way up to become the president of Midwestern Railroads. When the war with the South begins, he'll rejoin the Army, take command of a division of militia, and win early victories in West Virginia that go a long way at inspiring morale in the northern states. And now, at the age of just 34 years old, he is going to take command of the largest army in the Western Hemisphere. This new commander is General George B. McClellan, and his experience and belief in training and military discipline were exactly what the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac needed at that time. The moment McClellan assumes command, he's going to immediately get to work at reshaping and retraining this field army. He discharges unfit officers, replacing them with more capable leaders. He reorganizes the structure. He begins training and drilling the troops daily and enforces very strict military discipline in the ranks. His efforts will have a drastic effect on the men that made up the Army of the Potomac. He will turn them from a disorganized group of militia, essentially, into an army of trained and disciplined soldiers. The Northern press will praise McClellan and his reshaping of the army, so much so that they will even give him a nickname, the Young Napoleon. And to the people in that time, in their eyes, he was a young Napoleon. He was going to be the savior of the Union. And the fact of the matter is, although he will not become the young Napoleon that the people in this time thought he would be, what he does when he assumes command of the Army of the Potomac will lay the groundwork for the effectiveness and capabilities that army will become known for later in the war. But right along with all the good things that he accomplishes, McClellan has many negative qualities, and they will become quite visible to Lincoln in a very short amount of time. The first of which is going to be his ego. McClellan already had a huge ego to begin with, and now the praise from the Northern press is going to inflate that ego to an outrageous level. McClellan is going to believe that he is vastly superior in intelligence to everyone he interacts with. In particular, he's going to think that of General Winfield Scott, who is the commanding general of the entire Union Army at this time, and, more shockingly, Abraham Lincoln. In McClellan's mind, he could win the war if the old man, in air quotes, that's General Scott, would get out of the way and let him conduct the war as he saw fit. He would harass Winfield Scott to turn over command of the Union Army relentlessly, and by November, General Winfield Scott had had enough. He will retire from the Army and relinquish his command, leaving the space vacant for none other than George B. McClellan. And before the young Napoleon takes over the position of commanding general of the Union Army, Lincoln tries to warn him that it is going to be incredibly difficult and extremely taxing to on top of commanding the Army of the Potomac on campaign out in the field, simultaneously managed commanding the entire Union Army. And McClellan's answer to this bit of advice from Abraham Lincoln gives you a glimpse of really what McClellan thought of himself and, honestly, his greatness. When Lincoln tells him, hey man, this is going to be pretty difficult to do both these things, he'll say simply, I can do it all. Another negative quality that quickly becomes evident, not just to Lincoln, but to the general public as well, was his lack of initiative. And people have argued since the end of the war as to what influential factors were motivating McClellan to act in this regard, so I won't speculate and add to that argument. What I can say with certainty is, for whatever the reason, McClellan would not attack with his army. Like I said, he has the largest army in the Western Hemisphere at this time, and he refused to do anything with it. By October, the Army of the Potomac had a strength of 120,000 men. He's going to outnumber General Joseph Johnston, who's down at Manassas Junction with his Confederate field army. He's going to outnumber him 3-1. Johnston's only going to have 40,000 men. And even with that overwhelming advantage, McClellan doesn't leave Washington. One thing that did contribute to his failure to employ his new field army is he believed, or at least claimed to believe, the reports regarding the size and strength of the Confederate forces in Virginia. Now, these are being given to him by the head of his intelligence service, a man named Allen Pinkerton. And Pinkerton estimated Southern forces to be at a strength of 150,000 men at this time. That I find a little hard to do, too. You go from 40,000 men and you get a number of 150,000 men. It seems like somewhere in his intelligence gathering chain, there was a link broken. But nonetheless, McClellan's going to believe that. And when the president asks him why he's not doing anything, or asks him what his plans are, when he is going to attack the enemy, McClellan will say that besides being outnumbered right now, I still have a lot of preparation I have to do. And that he would need at least 200,000 men to launch an offensive against the Confederates. But the truth of the matter is, for McClellan at least, preparation never seemed to come to an end. He's just one of those guys that no matter how much time he never had all his ducks in a row. He never felt like he was ready to move. And the public is going to grow more and more impatient, waiting on the young Napoleon to attack Confederate forces. Now, something that is going to add a little more fuel to the fire as far as trying to get McClellan to do something with his army. In late October of 1862, McClellan is going to give orders to a general named Charles P. Stone for him to send part of his division on a reconnaissance in force. That simply means that unlike, what you would see in a movie nowadays with our modern special forces guys, the covert reconnaissance missions where everybody's being sneaky and quiet. Unlike that, a reconnaissance in force means that patrol, when they go out, are going to take enough men with them that they'll be able to fight whatever enemy they encounter. So on October 21st, Stone will do as McClellan has asked of him, and he will send out a patrol of around 300 men to conduct this reconnaissance in force. Soon after crossing the river, the Union troops engage with Confederate skirmishers that they run into. And as the skirmishing between Union and Confederates continue, more and more Southern troops begin arriving to help in the fight. And there will be Union officers that are trying to send reinforcements to help the lone patrol, but those men have to cross the Potomac, and they're doing it with just 4 rowboats. So this is going to delay them. And eventually the Union skirmish line will get pushed back to the edge of the Potomac to a hill called Ball's Bluff. Now, once they were there, they are closer to friendly forces, so they're able to link up with some Union reinforcements that are making it to that side of the river, but it's not going to be enough. And the rebels who these Union troops are engaged with will eventually charge the Union position on Ball's Bluff, and it will overwhelm and rout the Federals. This is going to happen so fast that many of those Union soldiers are going to be driven down the steep slopes of Ball's Bluff and into the river. And again, like I said, they had 4 rowboats that they were using to cross this river earlier, and they do attempt to try to cross in those boats back to the safety of the northern side. But they're quickly going to be overcrowded by fleeing men, and they will all capsize. And the most heartbreaking tragedy in all of this for the Federals is a large number of the fleeing Union troops, even to include the wounded as well, will drown in the process of trying to swim across the river. There are accounts of numerous Union corpses floating downriver as far as D.C. and even to Mount Vernon in the days following this battle. Of the roughly 1,700 Union troops that are eventually engaged in this battle, the Battle of Ball's Bluff, There will be over 200 killed, and among the dead is a man named Edward Dickinson Baker, who is, to this day, the only sitting U.S. Senator ever to be killed in battle, and a very close personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's. Another 226 will be wounded in this fight, and roughly 500 more will be taken prisoner instead of trying to swim to safety across the Potomac. While this battle is small in scale, it is yet another battle that the Union has to add to a very quickly growing list of defeats since the outbreak of the war. The Battle of Ball's Bluff will also have major political implications that plague the Union Army until the war's conclusion. In the public's eyes, this disaster needed to be revenged. Someone in command needed to be held accountable, and the Confederates needed to be held accountable. And more, they are going to put pressure on McClellan to act. And what all that boils down to is now more than ever, Lincoln and the Union needed a victory.
Being a U.S. Marine and fighting for my country is one of the things in my life I am most proud of. Although there are so many positives that came from my experience in the Marine Corps, like many of you, I had another battle I had to fight when my service was done. It's no secret that PTSD affects many active duty and former servicemen and women every day, as well as their family members and the first responder community. If you or a family member is struggling with PTSD, Colby and I recommend looking into the Mighty Oaks Foundation for help in your battle with this condition. The Mighty Oaks Foundation is a faith-based veteran service organization that teaches combat veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress how to get beyond combat trauma and live their lives in the manner God intended. Many combat vets are unable to reintegrate back into civilian life, leaving their families to deal with the aftermath of broken homes and suicide at times. By aligning their lives to biblical principles, these warriors are able to lead their families, their communities, and our nation. Their mission is to serve and restore our nation's warriors and families who have endured hardship through their service to America, and to help them find a new life purpose through hope in Christ and their resiliency and peer-to-peer recovery programs. More than 4,000 alumni have participated in Mighty Oaks programs, as they maintain one of the highest success rates of any recovery program in preventing veteran suicide and divorce. In fact, their programs are so successful that they receive hundreds of active duty military on official orders each year. Additionally, through a proactive effort, Mighty Oaks has provided resiliency programs to over 150,000 active duty troops on military bases worldwide. Find more information on the Mighty Oaks Foundation by visiting americafogofwar.com and follow the link Mighty Oaks Foundation located in the menu at the top of the homepage. Never fight alone. Get some backup in your fight with PTSD today.
So far in our story, with only one major battle, we've really only had to look at Virginia as the theater of operation for the war. But we're getting to a point now where there will be fighting all over the country in multiple theaters, and I believe it will be helpful in understanding the story if you knew what those theaters were. There are 3 theaters of operation in the Civil War. The first, and by far the most popular, is the Eastern Theater of Operations. It consists of Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the North Carolina coast. The First Battle of Manassas is fought in the Eastern Theater, just so you have a little bit of a reference there. Then there's the Western Theater of Operations, and it is just as important as the Eastern Theater is, but for a multitude of reasons, its historical popularity isn't as prominent. The Western Theater is made up of everything east of the Mississippi River, minus the area that makes up the Eastern Theater of Operations. This is going to be places like Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Carolinas. The third and final theater is the Trans-Mississippi Theater of Operations, and this is everything west of the Mississippi River, minus California, Oregon, and Washington State. Now, the reason you're going to need to know that is because on January 27th of 1861, in an effort to get McClellan to move his army, Lincoln is going to issue General War Order No. 1. This is going to direct that all Union armies make operational movements toward Confederate forces and territories. And to try to get the men in these armies behind this effort and get their morale boosted and energetic about fighting the Confederacy, Lincoln's going to make the date for executing this offensive movement January 27th, the birthday of the guy that basically symbolizes the Union, George Washington. This proclamation not only affects McClellan and the Union forces in the Eastern Theater, but also puts generals in the Western Theater under political pressure to participate in this general offensive by the deadline as well. And at this stage in the war, the Union military command out west is suffering greatly from a lack of unified command. They're organized into 3 separate departments, each department really kind of managing its own affairs. And each of these 3 department commanders believes they have the best solution to winning the war. Each one of them will refuse to find any strategy built out of compromise with either of the other 2 commanders. These 3 departments will be the Department of Kansas, the Department of the Ohio, and the Department of Missouri. Now, in particular, for our story today, we're going to focus in on the Department of Missouri, which is commanded by a guy named Henry Halleck. He's a major general. Halleck is the kind of guy that's so ambitious and in such a deceptive and selfish way that he will become notoriously known as a general you did not want to work with. In his book, Where the South Lost the War, author Kendall D. Gott says this about Halleck, quote, "Although he had impressive credentials, Henry Halleck was not an easy man to work for. The nature of his job and his personality often provoked antagonism, hatred, and contempt. Halleck's strengths were organizing, coordinating, planning, and managing. He was also prone to violent hatred and never cultivated close relationships. Overall, he generated no love, confidence, or respect." End quote. And if those comments about Halleck doesn't make it clear enough that he's not going to be the commander that Lincoln is looking for, I can tell you that he won't be. The one who is, however, is under Halleck's command. He's one of his subordinate officers. And like McClellan, this guy is a West Point graduate and a veteran of the Mexican-American War, where he earned not 1 but 2 citations for bravery in combat. Now, unlike McClellan, he is not going to be a meteoric success at everything he puts his hands to. After returning from Mexico, he'll be sent to serve at a fort out west, and while there on assignment, whether it be from boredom or being separated from his family, his wife, whatever the reason is, he's going to develop a pretty bad drinking problem, and he will more or less be forced out of the Army. As a civilian, he's going to fail at almost everything he puts his hands to, and he and his family will live in poverty almost the entire time he's out of the military. And when something that is completely outside of his control happens, that's the war starting, he will re-enter the Army, and right from the get-go, he is going to hit his stride at full speed. He'll quickly be promoted to brigadier general and get to work at making a name for himself. Now, he's had a few successes up to this point, but the most impressive thing about this guy, and you can see it not just in his time in the military, but throughout his entire life. I mean, even that era where he was failing as a civilian. He's the physical embodiment of the iron will that the Union has started to display in the wake of First Manassas that I had talked about at the beginning of the show. And by 1865, he is going to use that iron will that he had spent his entire life cultivating and strengthening to end the war. This man is an incredible general and combat leader whose name is listed among the greatest generals in American history. And that is none other than Ulysses S. Grant. At this point in our story, Grant and his command, and its 2 divisions together numbering between 15 and 17,000 men, are at a river port town called Cairo in Illinois. It's while he's in Cairo that Grant learns the Union strategy is going to be shifting its focus in the Western Theater of Operations, making its key objective controlling the key rivers in that region. And they want to control those rivers because those waterways give them access deeper into Southern territory. It gives them avenues by which they can resupply and reinforce their armies. And the capture of those rivers will also take those capabilities away from the South. Again, going back, way back to the beginning of this whole thing, when looking at the grand strategy for pursuing this entire war, right, all 3 theaters combined, it's the Anaconda Plan, to cut the Confederacy in half and then squeeze it into submission, essentially. And that involves capturing the Mississippi River. Well, the Mississippi River is very fortified, and to maneuver on those positions around the Mississippi River, the Federals are going to use a multitude of other rivers to do so. In his personal memoirs, Grant describes in his own words the situation the Union faces and what they would have to deal with if they're going to succeed at capturing these rivers. He says this, quote, "The enemy at this time occupied a line running from the Mississippi River at Columbus to Bowling Green and Mill Springs, Kentucky. Each of these positions was strongly fortified, as were also points on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers near the Tennessee state line. The works on the Tennessee were called Fort Hyman and Fort Henry, and that on the Cumberland was Fort Donelson." End quote. Now, one of the basic concepts in warfare is to hit an enemy in its flank if you want to get him to move. Another rising star in the Union Army, General George H. Thomas, and 5,000 Union troops will hit that Confederate line on one of its flanks. They will defeat a roughly 4,000-man Confederate force at the Battle of Mill Springs in Kentucky, killing a Confederate general in the process. This victory dislodges the right flank of that Confederate line Grant mentions in the previous quote. Now, the rest of that line had to be dealt with, and to get that accomplished, the next step would be to capture Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. Grant describes the importance of the two forts like this, quote, "With Fort Henry in our hands, we had a navigable stream open to us up to Muscle Shoals in Alabama. This road, of vast importance to the enemy, would cease to be of use to them for through traffic the moment Fort Henry became ours. Fort Donelson was the gate to Nashville, a place of great military and political importance, and to a rich country extending far east in Kentucky. With these 2 points in our possession, the enemy would necessarily be thrown back to the Memphis and Charleston road, or to the boundary of the Cotton States." End quote. To do this, the Union will have to construct gunboats capable of navigating rivers. They'll end up building a gunboat flotilla that consists of 7 vessels, 3 timber-clad gunboats, and 4 of the latest technological development in naval warfare, ironclad gunboats. Up to this point, ships and other watercraft, even those used in battle, were made of wood. This is an innovative development in naval warfare capabilities, and it is a giant step toward those capabilities we will be accustomed to in modern naval warfare. Soldiers at the time will call this gunboat flotilla by a nickname, the Brown Water Navy. Command of the Brown Water Navy will be given to a man who, since the start of his naval career in 1822, has served practically all over the world. I mean, he's served in the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the African coast. He even circumnavigated the globe in 1837. He will be made a flag officer in the U.S. Navy at the start of this campaign. His name is Andrew H. Foote. And General Grant will partner with Flag Officer Foote for a combined Army-Navy offensive against the Confederates holding Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. The two of them submit the plan to Henry Halleck, and he decides to give them the green light for the mission. Now, this plan was for Foote's Brown Water Navy to attack Fort Henry from the front, while Grant's infantry marched overland in a maneuver that would allow them to attack the fort from the rear. Once Fort Henry was captured, the Brown Water Navy would steam back up the Tennessee River and into the Cumberland, making their way over to Fort Donelson, while Grant and his Army of the Tennessee marched there overland. And essentially the two of them would rinse and repeat, do the same thing they did to Fort Henry at Fort Donelson. And after the 2 trips it takes to transport all of Grant's infantry, they will land in a position 3 miles north of Fort Henry. Grant and Foote will agree to launch the attack the next morning on February 6th. Now, manning the defenses of Fort Henry are 3,000 Confederates who are in very poor shape. They are armed with very outdated flintlock muskets, and many of them are suffering from sickness due to the poor conditions inside Fort Henry. There had been a lot of heavy rain that month, which caused the river to rise and submerge most of the fort underwater. Out of the 17 guns that the fort had to defend itself with, 8 of those guns and the powder magazine will be underwater. When the Confederate commander of the garrison at Fort Henry discovers the strength of Grant's forces and that they are, in fact, moving to take his position, he decides to withdraw the majority of those men to the more defendable Fort Donelson, just 12 miles overland to the east. So on the morning of February 6th, when Foote's Brown Water Navy arrives at their designated position, they launch their attack on Fort Henry, and the very few Confederates that are left inside will try to last as long as they can. Now, because of all the rain that they have been getting that month and the rough terrain between where Grant's men began their march and Fort Henry, the Army of the Tennessee will be delayed. In fact, they won't get a chance to join in the fighting at all. Foote's naval bombardment of Fort Henry lasts a little over an hour before the handful of Confederates, which is around 100 men and officers, capitulate and surrender the fort. And just like that, Fort Henry was captured and control of the Tennessee River was in Union hands. Right after Fort Henry surrenders, Foote is going to send a detachment of 3 timberclads on a mission up the Tennessee River to destroy as many military supplies as they can. The raid will reach as far as Muscle Shoals, which is just past Florence, Alabama. And on top of destroying supplies like Foote had charged them with, they will also take out a very important railroad bridge for the Memphis and Ohio Railroad. With that rail link severed, the Confederates' ability to move reinforcements in the area was restricted, as was their ability to withdraw forces from Kentucky and East Tennessee. The commanding general of all Confederate forces in the Western Theater, a man named Albert Sidney Johnston, has to make a few decisions. Whether to pull back his men from Fort Donelson and from Kentucky and other places in the region further south where he can reorganize, giving up very valuable terrain in the process, or double down and try to stop the Union advance where it is. He's going to decide to send reinforcements to Fort Donelson, which will bring the strength of the garrison defending Fort Donelson to around 17,000 men. A few days after the capture of Fort Henry, Grant's going to begin moving his field army toward Fort Donelson, and he will do so, for the most part, completely unmolested. It's not until they get within a very short distance of the fort that Grant's lead elements will encounter Confederate cavalry setting up a roadblock. That encounter marks the start of a 5-day battle between Grant's troops and the Confederate defenders for control of the fort. Now, the Brownwater Navy is not going to experience the same immediate success at Fort Donelson that it did at Fort Henry. And that's because of the dominant position Fort Donelson's guns had on the Cumberland River. Foote's gunboats and his sailors will take a beating over the next few days, and the fight for Fort Donelson would be primarily an infantry battle. Things are not looking good for the Confederates. They are surrounded and cut off from retreat. The majority of them are armed with very outdated firearms, and the likelihood that they will run out of supplies in the dead of winter is getting more and more realistic. So the leaders inside Fort Donelson will give orders to launch an attack on the 4th day of fighting. This attack would essentially try to break through Grant's lines. And they come very close to succeeding, but for a multitude of reasons, some that make sense and some that don't. The Confederates will return to the fort, and Grant, showing early signs of the commander he will be, will rally his forces that have been pushed back and counter the rebels, taking his former positions and reclaiming every bit of ground he had lost. So the Confederates are yet again in Fort Donelson, contemplating what their next step is. And in a moment I can only imagine as devastating for the Confederate soldiers inside Fort Donelson, not one, but 2 of the highest-ranking officers in the fort will abandon their command and leave the duty of surrendering the fort to one of their junior officers. That junior officer is a West Point classmate of Grant's, and the next morning, February 16th, he will ask Grant what his terms for surrender are, and Grant will respond simply that no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. That reply will have Northern reporters calling Grant Unconditional Surrender Grant and newspapers all across the North. The Confederate officer, although unhappy with Grant's terms, surrenders the near 13,000 men under his command and the fort. And now the Union not only had control of the Tennessee River, it also had control of the Cumberland as well. The capturing of Forts Henry and Donelson are the first significant Union victories in this war, and with the control of the 2 rivers comes the opportunity to stab deeper into the heart of the South. It also meant that the Confederate defensive line that ran from the Mississippi River to the Alleghenies was now untenable, and they're going to be forced to pull out of Kentucky and most of the towns and cities in Tennessee. The most important of those is the river town of Nashville. And to give you an idea of how bad this is for the Confederacy and how many men they've just had taken out of their pool of effective fighting men, with this surrender, Grant will capture more enemy soldiers than all previous American generals combined. So, a lot of guys. Because of all this, Grant will become the nation's most popular general overnight. One little interesting thing that happens, the newspapers are going to report that Grant wins this battle with a cigar clamped in his teeth. Now, keep in mind, Grant's not a big cigar smoker to begin with at this point in his life. But when hundreds of his admirers across the country read that about Grant, they'll start sending him cigars, boxes and boxes of cigars. So Grant decides to take up smoking cigars. But as the rest of the country praised Grant and celebrated his victories, there is one guy who would begin to resent him for it. And that is his commander, Major General Henry Halleck. Halleck is jealous of Grant's success and sudden fame. He believed that the public's praise should have been given to him for being the department's commanding general and having green-lighted the operation to begin with. This starts to get at Halleck so much that he'll fabricate stories about Grant and attempt to get him relieved of command. In a telegram to McClellan, he's going to recommend that the Army promote one of Grant's division commanders from the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson campaign over Grant. Halleck also is going to suggest to McClellan that he, Halleck, because of this success in the West and because of his grand strategical and tactical mind, he should be giving command of all Union forces in the Western Theater. Well, 2 weeks are going to go by, and Halleck isn't going to get a response from McClellan, so he's going to wire McClellan again. This time he's going to say that he hadn't received any communication from General Grant for over a week, and that Grant had left his command at Fort Donelson without orders and went to Nashville. 3 days later, Halleck will send another message to McClellan claiming that Grant had started drinking again. Now, keep in mind, Grant's drinking problem was known throughout the Army and the government. And although what Halleck had to say was untrue, that message from Halleck will cause Grant problems long after this issue between Halleck, McClellan, and himself is resolved. Halleck was getting carried away. He had relieved Grant of his command and was close to placing him under arrest when Lincoln decides he needs to step in. See, Lincoln needed commanders that were willing to fight and that produced victories, and he couldn't allow the only commander that had done that for him so far in this war to be sidelined. Instead of following Halleck's wishes, Lincoln is going to promote Grant to the rank of Major General and have Halleck place him back in command of the Army of the Tennessee. For Lincoln, Grant was a blessing. His victories at Henry and Donelson came at a time when the Union needed them the most. But Lincoln had massive obstacles to overcome in his role as commander-in-chief and a horrendous heartbreak to endure in his personal life at this time. During a ball at the White House in early February, one of Lincoln's sons, Willie, will come down with an illness, and today they think that was most likely typhoid that he had contracted as a result of the unsanitary conditions in Washington, D.C. at that time, which were terrible. But because of the sudden onset of illness, Willie would be confined to his bed. His screams and pleas to make it stop could be heard throughout the entire White House, tormenting his terrified parents continuously. And after 15 days of this, Willie dies. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book Team of Rivals, recounts the extreme feeling of loss that overcame the president after Willie's death. She says this, quote, "Minutes later, Lincoln burst into Nikolai's office. 'Well, Nikolai,' he said, 'my boy is gone. He is actually gone.' Lincoln buried his head in his hands, and his tall frame was convulsed with emotion. 'This is the hardest trial of my life,' he said. 'Why is it? Oh, why is it?'" End quote. A little later, Goodwin continues describing this time in Lincoln's life, and it is clear to see that he was balancing on a very narrow ledge between being in control and hopelessly lost. Quote, "That blow overwhelmed me," he told a White House visitor. "It showed me my weakness as I had never felt it before." While reading aloud a passage from Shakespeare's King John in which Constance grieves over the death of her son, Lincoln paused. He turned to a nearby Army officer and said, "Did you ever dream of some lost friend and feel that you were having a sweet communion with them, and yet have a consciousness that it was not a reality? That is the way I dream of my lost boy, Willie." End quote. I can't imagine the immeasurable grief that comes with losing a child, and I hope that is something I never have to experience. At the very least, I don't think I would be able to get out of bed, let alone go to work. But Lincoln will. He would continue fulfilling his duties to the country and very rarely let his emotions be seen by those working closely with him. Outwardly, he would portray the image of a commander-in-chief, but internally he was suffering the worst tragedy there is to suffer. It won't be long before the men in Grant's field army would suffer a tragedy of their own. It's no secret that Brett and I have been friends since we were 18 and in the first year of our enlistments. Well, a few years ago, we decided that we needed to see each other with more consistency than we had been up to that point. But it would have to be a trip of some kind because we lived on opposite ends of the country. For us, there was no better way to spend our time together than being out on one of the many battlefields all across the country. We would take 2 trips a year, each of them just for a few days, and go park the car, get out, and walk a battlefield like Antietam or Gettysburg. And we'd have a blast. It's on one of those trips we decided to start America Fog of War. Walking America's battlefields in the footsteps of the men that fought the battle is the best way to learn the legacy of the American warrior and to really appreciate the sacrifices they made. Brett and I both still do it, and although it's usually for researching the subject matter of our show these days, it's still fun. If you're interested in following the Army of Northern Virginia's invasion into Maryland, or its retreat after the defeat at Gettysburg, or Grant's 1864 Overland Campaign, then I highly recommend checking out Civil War Trails. I've been a fan of Civil War Trails and what they do since Brett and myself started doing these battlefield trips all those years ago. They're an awesome organization. They make historical interpretation of the American warrior's legacy easier to access and enjoy for everyone. If you'd like more information on Civil War Trails and what they do and all the different sites that they have for you to explore, then go check out civilwartrails.org. Find a battlefield or a site that you want to visit and stand in the footsteps of the men and women that made this country what it is today. Grant is going to have this core level understanding of momentum, and he wants to take advantage of that momentum. His army is reinforced with extra divisions. He now has 45,000 men in the Army of the Tennessee, and he's got the rebels on their heels. So he loads his guys into boats and moves them further down the Tennessee River. He's going to establish his forward operating base for this coming offensive on the western bank of the river at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. From there, he could prepare and eventually launch an offensive for the next major Union objective in the Western Theater. It's a railroad hub that connects the 2 lines that make up the only continuous track of railroad that link the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast. It's in a small town in northeastern Mississippi called Corinth. And at his forward operating base at Pittsburgh Landing, Grant is only 20 miles from Corinth. Now, one thing I haven't covered about General Halleck yet, this is Grant's superior officer. He is extremely cautious in the way he approaches warfare. Right around this time, he's going to let that caution get the better of him, and he'll send orders to Grant telling Grant to halt his plans and stay in place at Pittsburgh Landing. Halleck wants Grant to wait for Don Carlos Buell and his 30,000-man Army of the Ohio that's over in Nashville to march to Pittsburgh Landing, link up with and consolidate with Grant's forces, and together the 2 armies could conduct a joint offensive against the Confederates holding Corinth. This is honestly by the book strategically sound, right? He's consolidating his forces, and because of that consolidation, will outnumber them drastically. So Grant halts his operations, has his guys set up their tents, make their encampments. After being reinforced and having a strength of around 40 to 45,000 men in his Army of Mississippi, General Albert Sidney Johnston is going to learn of the move from Nashville to Pittsburgh Landing and the plan for Grant to consolidate his forces with the Army of the Ohio. He will also be informed that because of flooded rivers and a number of bridges being destroyed or at least being disabled, the Army of the Ohio is delayed and they are still en route to Pittsburgh Landing. General Johnston's going to decide to take advantage of this separated Union force and attack Grant at Pittsburgh Landing before the Army of the Ohio can reinforce him and defeat in detail. This is a pretty well-known military tactic. If you have a smaller force, you try to hit the enemy when they're separated and defeat them piece by piece. Now, around this point in time, there's going to be some moving pieces when it comes to the Confederate High Command. PGT Beauregard, who we had talked about both in the Fort Sumter episode and the First Manassas episode, will be sent to join Johnston out west. And when Beauregard arrives, there's a little bit of confusion between the two. They're kind of uncertain who is supposed to be in overall command and who's supposed to be filling in that support role. But at the end of the day, it's going to be Johnston's campaign. It's his army. It's his campaign. But he will have Beauregard plan the assault. And the plan that Beauregard comes up with is an extremely complicated one. He's going to try to coordinate 4 Confederate corps. So remember back to a few episodes ago, I talked about, the brigade being the primary tactical unit of the Civil War. Well, you've got 3 or 4 brigades in a division, and then you're going to have 3 or 4 divisions in a corps, right? So anywhere between 10,000 and 15,000 guys in one of these corps. In a time where they have no other communication besides couriers and messengers, they're going to try to coordinate the attack on Grant's forces between 4 Confederate corps, and the troops making up those corps are practically brand new. And just like McDowell learned in his movement to Manassas a few months before this, Beauregard will learn an army of new and inexperienced troops cannot move quickly from one place to another, particularly in this era. Beauregard and the Confederates are going to experience terrible weather, which will contribute even more to their inability to march. And in the end, it's going to take the Confederates 3 days to march 18 miles. And because of all the delays the Confederates are experiencing, Beauregard will suggest to Johnston they should cancel the attack and withdraw back to Corinth. Beauregard can't imagine that they still have the element of surprise on their side. Grant and the Federals had to have learned something of the large Confederate troop movement taking place just to their south. Again, remember, they started out only 20 miles apart. So in all reality, Beauregard should have been right. But the Union High Command, and this is even including Grant, believes that Johnston and his 45,000 Confederates are still in the defenses around Corinth, even after receiving multiple reports suggesting Confederate activity in the area around Pittsburgh Landing. They're still going to be under this impression that there's no way Johnston's leaving the protection of his defenses. Grant talks about this in his memoir and how unlikely he thought a Confederate attack was. He says this, quote, "I regarded the campaign we were engaged in as an offensive one and had no idea that the enemy would leave strong entrenchments to take the initiative when he knew he would be attacked where he was if he remained," end quote. Just real quick, the history nerd in me has to point out, I love that quote because it's like getting to glimpse the strategic thought process of one of the greatest generals the U.S. has ever had. Grant's highlighting one of the numerous variables that a field army commander has to plan for. He's talking about trying to account for the cunning of the enemy leader he is facing. And the tactically sound thing for Johnston to do in this situation would have been staying in his entrenchments at Corinth. In this era, fighting a defensive fight, for the most part, up until a little later on in the war, is going to be the best strategy you can come up with. But again, Grant feels like he has that momentum after Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And in his mind, they were conducting, like he said, an offensive campaign. So because of this, Grant has created for himself and his soldiers a vulnerability to an enemy attack. And Johnston, albeit unknowingly, is going to take advantage of that vulnerability. When Beauregard suggests to him that he withdraw back to Corinth, Johnston tells him no. And on the night of April 5th, he'll issue orders for an attack that's going to begin first thing the next morning. To give you a little mental picture of the Union positions near Pittsburgh Landing, Grant's line made an almost perfect 90-degree angle with the Tennessee River and was oriented facing to the south. So his left side, his left flank, would be touching the western bank of the Tennessee River, and from there, the Union line stretches 6 miles directly to the west. This area is heavily forested with tons of little streams or creeks or small offshoots from the Tennessee River. And because of the rains that have been giving the Confederates so much trouble, that those streams and creeks were flooded. This is an advantage for Grant, and even though he's not as defensively prepared as he should be, his position along with the flooded waterways will make attacking his flanks almost an impossibility. So the Confederates getting ready to attack his line are going to be forced to attack him along the front, which is the last thing you want to have to do if you're one of the guys having to actually conduct the attack. But again, this is not going to be all rainbows and raids for Grant and the Union. Besides still waiting on the Army of the Ohio to arrive from Nashville, Grant won't even have all of his own men with him there at Pittsburgh Landing. One of his 6 divisions under the command of a guy named General Lew Wallace is encamped 8 miles north of Grant at a place called Crump's Landing. This means instead of his entire 45,000-man field army, Grant will only have 33,000 men to put in the fight against Albert Sidney Johnston's Confederates, who again are numbering somewhere between 40 and 45,000. But now that you have at least a vague image of the lay of the land, we arrive at the morning of April 6th, 1862, the morning of the battle. And before sunrise, a security patrol sent out by one of Grant's brigades is going to encounter advance units of the Confederate battle line in the woods south of the Union position. The patrol began skirmishing with the advanced Confederates, and they're going to quickly realize that the guys they're exchanging gunfire with are not just some random Confederate patrol, but in fact the entire Confederate army marching directly towards Pittsburgh Landing. This little interaction between this Union patrol and the advancing Confederates is enough to really alter what could have been a nightmare for the Union Army in this battle. That Union patrol will continue to move back towards friendly lines, but they're going to do so slowly, and they're going to be skirmishing with the Confederates the entire way back. See, back in their encampments and the encampments of the other divisions in Grant's army, most of the guys are still asleep. And if they are not warned ahead of time of the mass of Confederate troops marching towards them, they'll get massacred. They're trying to let their gunfire basically serve as a warning for the rest of the guys, sleeping back in their tents. Well, two divisions will hear the gunfire and quickly begin forming battle lines. One of those division commanders is a general who will become a legend in this war. He's considered by many to be the first, in air quotes, modern general in his approach to warfare, and he too will become one of the greatest military leaders the United States has ever had. His name is William Tecumseh Sherman, and it's at this battle that Sherman begins to transform into that premier combat leader he is remembered as today. And just as his division had gotten formed up and in position, the first wave of Confederates is going to crash directly into them. This first meeting between Grant's and Johnston's troops is on the right side of the Union line, and near this section of the line is a small log church the locals had given a Hebrew name, meaning place of peace. It's that small church that will lend its name to this two-day battle, one of the costliest battles fought in the Civil War, and up to that point in time will be the costliest battle America had ever been in. The name of that small church is Shiloh, and its battle is well underway by this point. General Grant, when he hears the sound of the battle getting underway, is just sitting down for breakfast several miles downriver and on the other side of the river at his headquarters in Savannah, Tennessee. Once he hears the first few volleys exchanged, Grant will look at his staff and say, "Gentlemen, the ball is in motion," and immediately he will start to do what Grant does best. He will get to work. First, he sends couriers to the lead elements of Buell's Army of the Ohio, who are still marching many miles east of where Grant is at this time. He's also going to send a courier to Lew Wallace's division as well, the one at Crump's Landing. And in both messages, Grant is going to urge them to move forward quickly to join in the fighting. And once the couriers had got their messages and departed for their assigned locations, one going to Lew Wallace, the other going to the forward elements of the Army of the Ohio, Grant commandeers a riverboat to get him to the front as quickly as possible, because that is where he is needed most at this time. One of the main tasks of general officers on both sides of this war was to reorganize broken troop formations and plug holes in the line caused by mounting numbers of casualties. When Grant does arrive at Pittsburgh Landing, he does exactly that. He's going to hop on a horse, and as fast as he can, he's going to visit each one of his division commanders. He needs to get situation reports for all of them. He needs to encourage their troops. He needs to send reinforcements and resupplies to parts of the line that need it the most. And to do that, he's got to get out there and see it with his own eyes. Even while riding from one division to the next, many times throughout the day, Grant is going to rally and organize federal troops that had retreated from the fight earlier and send them back to the front. This is Grant's element, and he is completely submerged in it. The ultimate pressure player. The higher the pressure, the better he performs. And it's that quality that keeps his outnumbered and, to be completely honest, unprepared army in the fight. But just because they're in the fight doesn't mean the fight is going their way yet. And just as I was talking about momentum on the Union side of things earlier, right now the Confederacy has momentum in this fight. And as the fight continues to develop throughout the morning, the Confederates are going to have success pushing this Union line back, specifically the Union right flank. One of the divisions over there is General Sherman's division. Now, I'm going to take a second here to point out that the guys engaged in this fight are brand new, and this is on both sides. Sherman's men are definitely brand new. They weren't even around for the Forts Henry and Donelson campaign. But as soon as these green troops march out and face each other, and one of them lets go of that first volley, you'll have thousands of guys fleeing the battlefield. And I don't mean all in one clump. It's going to be a few here and a few there, but overall, along this 6-mile line, it starts adding up. And this is Confederates just as much as the Union troops. There are also staggering losses on both sides as well. And besides creating a chaotic nightmare for the brigade and regimental commanders trying to organize their troops, the staggering losses on both sides, combined with those guys that are retreating from the fight, is going to cause 2 divisions to have to retreat, one of those being Sherman's division. And in the process, the battle will degenerate into a disorganized melee, really, where it's just a series of gunfights in scattered pockets all across the line. By around 10:30, Johnston and the Confederates had accomplished a major tactical objective, which was to bend back Grant's defensive line. But there's a problem. They bent it in the wrong direction. Instead of bending the line away from Pittsburgh Landing in the Tennessee River, if they were able to do that, it would have cut Grant off from any kind of reinforcements crossing the river to help in the fight, as well as resupplies and all kind of other things that are very valuable to someone engaged in a massive battle like Grant is at this point. But instead of bending it away from the river, Johnston bends the line towards Pittsburgh Landing, and it almost has the opposite effect. Grant gets to keep his access to reinforcements and supplies or whatever else needs to come in through Pittsburgh Landing. And maybe even more so important, at least in a tactical sense, this also shortens Grant's defensive line. And shortening a defensive line makes it stronger, especially when you have less guys than the attacking force does. This isn't the only thing that will contribute in a negative way to Johnston's early success. As the Confederates begin to pursue Sherman in his retreat through his division's encampment, where they had been sleeping the night before, and keep in mind this fight happened so quick, all their stuff is still there. And a lot of these Confederates are lacking when it comes to supplies, and numerous Confederates will leave their position in line to ransack through the tents and footlockers and whatever else they can find in this encampment that just a few hours ago belonged to Sherman's division. Confederate commanders are going to try to get them back in line, but they're not going to have much success, and this will end up delaying the Confederate advance. That delay is going to give Sherman the time he needs to get his men reorganized and primed for a counterattack. Keep in mind, like I mentioned earlier, it's at this battle that Sherman really begins to find his stride as a combat leader. And when he launches that counterattack sometime around noon, he does just that. Listen, this is crazy. Despite being wounded twice and having 3 horses shot out from underneath him, he would be everywhere along his division's lines. He's going to be shoring up these brand new troops. He's going to be inspiring the men to keep fighting. And for 3 hours, he will drive his division forward like this. So much so that he will push the rebels back far enough to reclaim his original position he had at the start of the day. And if my praise isn't enough, Grant will say this about Sherman's actions on that first day of battle in his memoir, quote, "A number of attempts were made by the enemy to turn our right flank where Sherman was posted, but every effort was repulsed with heavy loss. I never deemed it important to stay long with Sherman. Although his troops were then under fire for the first time, the commander, by his constant presence with them, inspired a confidence in officers and men that enabled them to render services on that bloody battlefield worthy of the best veterans." End quote. That's quite a vote of confidence from one of the most successful combat leaders the country's ever had. And as cool as it is to see a general like Sherman begin to develop into the legend he's remembered as, it's important to remember that throughout this entire time, the carnage and destruction this battle generates is astronomical. Grant will talk in his memoir about seeing a field that Confederates had made repeated charges over during this portion of the battle. And he'll say that because of the number of dead and wounded men laying in that field, it would have been possible to walk across that clearing in any direction without one of your feet touching the ground. I mean, that sounds like a nightmare in reality. And it's even more astonishing to think about the courage it took to do this and fight this fight when you consider that the men on both sides of this battle, most of them at least, are experiencing combat for the first time. And I know there are differences in the way that a battle was fought during the Civil War and the kind we fight now, but having the Battle of Shiloh be your first real engagement with the enemy seems unimaginably terrifying as an introduction to combat. I mean, my first gunfight with the Taliban lasted 3, maybe 4 hours at the most, and for the most part, everything went well. That's not to say it wasn't an intense experience. Maybe about 15 minutes into the fight, I came very close to catching a round in the face, but lucky for me, it wasn't my time, and the round missed me. It ricocheted off the wall next to me. But my introduction to combat was on such a smaller scale than the Battle of Shiloh. We had about 16 Marines on that patrol, and the Taliban had roughly the same number of guys. So around 30 combatants engaged in this fight total. And by the end of my first fight, the only casualties belonged to the Taliban. It's almost like I was eased into the nastiness of combat. The men fighting the Battle of Shiloh are experiencing the worst warfare has to offer right off the bat. One of the best personal accounts we have today on the experience of the common Civil War soldier was written by a Confederate private named Sam Watkins. And if you want to get a good idea of what life was like for the men in the ranks, the guys actually standing in lines of battle and firing their rifles at the forces lined up across from them, then I highly recommend reading his memoir on the war. Sam Watkins is at this battle, and he had been with his regiment since First Manassas, but they missed that battle, so this will be their first time actually engaging in combat with the Union. And around this time of the battle, his regiment is marching just behind that first wave of Confederates. They've been held in reserve. They're going to get orders to march forward and fill in a hole in the line, join in the fighting, essentially. His account of what happens next is honestly one of the best descriptions of the almost head-spinning transition a soldier's psyche experiences in that very unique moment when they're first introduced to the unmitigated chaos of a battlefield. Watkins will start out talking about witnessing another Confederate regiment retreating past his own, and this is what he says about it. Quote, "As we were advancing to the attack and to support the Alabama Brigade in our front, which had given way and were stricken with fear, some of the boys in our regiment would laugh at them and ask what they were running for." End quote. In the next paragraph, however, his regiment has made it to where the fighting is, and you can tell by how he writes that the mood surrounding him and his comrades had changed from a joking one, making fun of the guys retreating from the fight and filled with optimism that they'll be able to, meet whatever stands in their way, to a mood that is much more nervous and foreboding, which is a unique feature of seeing, at least for the first time, the reality of combat. And he'll continue like this, quote, "I had heard and read of battlefields, seen pictures of battlefields, of horses and men, of cannon and wagons, all jumbled together while the ground was strewn with dead and dying and wounded. But I must confess that I never realized the pomp and circumstance of the thing called glorious war until I saw this. Men were lying in every conceivable position, the dead lying with their eyes wide open, the wounded begging piteously for help, some waving their hats and shouting us to go forward. It all seemed to me a dream." End quote. It's hard to explain everything happening in your mind when you witness the reality of the task you're engaged in when you're on a battlefield. There is a dreamlike quality to it. And when I did finally see how terrible war can be, it was almost like an out-of-body experience. But I can't imagine the nerves Sam Watkins and the rest of the soldiers fighting near Shiloh were experiencing in this fight. I think it's amazing that the mind can be strong enough to endure something that terrifyingly shocking. Again, you get a glimpse of the worst of what humanity has to offer. But if you look close enough, the fortitude to be able to withstand that for something you believe in has to be among the very best qualities humanity can possess. There is one story in particular that stands out to me as being something that my mind would have had a difficult time trying to comprehend. Between 2 and 3 p.m., there will be very intense fighting on Grant's left flank. The division holding that flank had taken up positions in a peach orchard and were very stubbornly resisting the rebel advances. Well, just behind that Union line that stretched through the peach orchard was a small pond. And if you go to the battlefield today, you can find that pond. It has a tour marker and a plaque with a description of what happened there during the battle. And it's that plaque's inscription that I want to read for you now. This is what it says, quote, "This shallow pond attracted the weary and wounded soldiers of both armies who were engaged in heavy fighting nearby. Some crawled here for their last drink. Observers after the battle reported that the pond was littered with dead soldiers and horses, and blood had turned the water a murky red." End quote. That pond will be known as the Bloody Pond, and having to witness dying men crawl to reach a final sip of water would be a soul-crushing scene all by itself. But the thing that would have been just Otherworldly to my eyes was the blood-red pond in which floated the mangled bodies of enough dead men and horses to have dyed that pond red. I mean, that's insane. Where else do you see something like that? That's that Union line there in the peach orchard that is causing the most problems for Albert Sidney Johnston at this point in the fight, and he has to do something to knock those Federals out of that position. He will personally go to the front, just opposite the peach orchard, to rally his exhausted troops and organize them for a final unified attack. Throughout the entire Civil War, and most consistently in these early years of the war, there will be a big problem with commanders sending their brigades in piecemeal, one at a time. And the logical motivation behind that is to conserve your forces. What ends up happening is you continue to get brigade after brigade being pitted against a force that outnumbers them drastically, over and over and over. And that attack would eventually be successful at forcing those Federals back, but Johnston won't live to see their success. While pushing his troops forward and motivating them, Johnston will be hit by a bullet in the leg, which severs his femoral artery, and in a matter of minutes, Albert Sidney Johnston will bleed out and will become known to history as the highest-ranking officer killed throughout the entirety of the Civil War. Do you love America Fog of War and want more of it? If so, Brett and I would love it if you became a member of the America Fog of War Patreon. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link Become a Member located in the menu at the top of the homepage and pick from one of our 3 membership subscription options. As a member, you can enjoy ad-free early access to all of our free episodes, like this one, as well as gain access to not 1, but 2 extra episodes a month. Your membership subscriptions are what enable us to bring you the content you love every month. Help us grow this podcast and become part of the team today at americafogofwar.com. In an earlier episode, I talked about how the Civil War was an era of transition from traditional warfare to modern warfare, and that throughout the Civil War, you can see where the two approaches to warfare are blended together in a way that's unique to a transitional period. For instance, later on in this battle, the Brown Water Navy will use their guns to support Grant's infantry. They'll bombard the Confederates all night, and that is most definitely something you would see on a modern battlefield. At the same time, the traditional methods of warfare are involved in this fight too. And one of the things that falls under that traditional category is how much the death of a commanding officer can have an effect on the morale of the troops and the outcome of the battle. Confederate Sam Watkins says this about it in his memoir, quote, "Advancing a little further on, we saw General Albert Sidney Johnston surrounded by his staff and Governor Harris of Tennessee. We saw some little commotion among those who surrounded him, but we did not know at that time he was dead. That fact was kept from the troops." End quote. The reason that fact was kept from the troops is due to the head of the snake scenario. Cut off the head of the snake to defeat your enemy. And that's because it's a real problem that's been affecting armies since antiquity. So, silently, Beauregard takes over command of the Confederate forces and tries to maintain the momentum Johnston's created before his death. And he orders the assault that Johnston had initiated to be continued. Now, I mentioned earlier that Grant had sent couriers to Lew Wallace's division and to the lead elements of the Army of the Ohio marching in from Nashville. Those reinforcements are extremely important to Grant because, remember, at the start of the battle, Grant is outnumbered. And the unfortunate reality for Grant is that Lew Wallace's division had gotten lost on the march from Crump's Landing, making what should have been a 2-hour movement a march that would last 7 hours. The troops that are marching from Nashville were still many miles away from the battle and on the other side of the Tennessee River. These problems will reach a boiling point at around 4 p.m. for Grant, where, due to large numbers of casualties depleting his ranks and the lack of ammunition, Sherman, as well as one of the other divisions on the right flank of Grant's line, are going to have to fall back towards Pittsburgh Landing. Now, they do so for the most part unmolested by the Confederates. They had to halt as well and resupply their own ammunition. But again, this also means that Grant's right flank has dissolved and pulled back a long ways from where the front line is. Very shortly after that right flank retreats, the division holding his left flank is also going to begin a movement back towards Pittsburgh Landing. Now, both flanks of his line have retreated, and he still didn't have the reinforcements he had sent for earlier in the day. So he's going to have to make some kind of adjustment to keep his army alive and to minimize the Confederates' numerical advantage. He decides he needs to reorganize his line along a ridge near Pittsburgh Landing so he can strengthen it and at the same time best protect Pittsburgh Landing itself from being captured by the rebels. But withdrawing and reorganizing troops, especially new troops, is a very difficult and time-consuming task to accomplish. He's going to need a way to slow the Confederates down if he wants to be successful in this. His solution would come from the only two divisions that hadn't withdrawn towards Pittsburgh Landing yet. They were still holding their original positions and fighting very ferociously against the Confederates. Those two divisions belonged to Generals Benjamin Prentiss and W.H.L. Wallace, who are by this time detached and very far in advance of Grant's new defensive line. That, I have to tell you, is a position you do not want to be in. Their position is along a country lane that the Northern soldiers called the Sunken Road. The Confederates, due to the intensity of bullets swarming the air around that place, will call it the Hornet's Nest. To ensure he can get his new defensive line organized, Grant will tell Prentiss and Wallace to hold the Hornet's Nest at all costs. And although heavily outnumbered, the two generals would do exactly as Grant asked them. Tens of thousands of Confederates are going to close in on Prentiss's and Wallace's 6,200 men. And for almost 2 hours, the Yankees will repel attack after attack. Eventually, the Confederates are going to get so frustrated that they will employ the fire of over 60 cannon against the resisting Federals, which is, up to that time, the largest concentration of artillery fire to be used on the North American continent. At around 5:30, the Confederate bombardment and constant rifle fire is close to overwhelming the Federals in the Hornet's Nest. And Generals Wallace and Prentiss know that rebel infantry can't be far from completely encircling them. So they're going to issue orders for their men to withdraw back to Pittsburgh Landing and link up with the rest of Grant's army. Their hunch was correct. The Confederates are very close to encircling them completely and are moving quickly to make that a reality. A few of their regiments will narrowly escape the Hornet's Nest, but the majority of the surviving troops under Wallace and Prentiss will be trapped where they had been fighting since the start of the day. While this is all going on, Wallace will be mortally wounded, and most of his brigades will surrender to the rebels when they hear this news. Prentiss will live and eventually capitulate, surrendering roughly 2,200 men to the Confederates. It's because of his and W.H.L. Wallace's efforts, Grant had the time he needed to get the rest of his men in position. Around the time the Federals in the Hornet's Nest surrender, the sun will set, and that will be the close of the first day's fighting. Beauregard's going to decide to halt his soldiers after seeing how exhausted they are and let them rest and continue the assault in the morning. After the way the first day of fighting played out for the Confederates, Beauregard is going to be pretty confident that in the morning he would have a complete victory over Grant, and he's going to have a moment where he counts his eggs before they're hatched. He's going to write Confederate President Jefferson Davis and inform him of this major victory in Tennessee. Now, if you look at it from his point of view, it's easy to see why he felt that way. His Confederates had successfully pushed the Union line back 2 miles and inflicted large numbers of casualties on the Federals. And sure, they did pay a high cost in doing so. They're going to take around 8,500 casualties themselves by the end of the day. But the Union forces had too, which meant Beauregard, with roughly 25,000 effective troops, still should have outnumbered Grant's forces holding Pittsburgh Landing. But Beauregard was unaware of a few things, and the first of those is that throughout the evening, the troops that Grant had sent for from the Army of the Ohio and Lew Wallace's division had arrived to reinforce Grant. Together, they will add 25,000 fresh troops to Grant's Army of the Tennessee, and this will swing the numerical advantage in favor of the Union. Another thing Beauregard wasn't aware of was at the root of everything, Grant was a relentless fighter. There's a fairly popular story of a conversation between Grant and Sherman that took place that night. This story perfectly highlights Grant's iron will quality and his unflinching resolve in the face of setbacks, and his tendency to fight even harder the more of those setbacks he encountered. Sometime after midnight, Sherman, while considering his losses, will remark, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" And I can picture this in my head so vividly. While smoking one of his cigars, Grant's going to look up and answer Sherman. He'll say, "Yes," puff on his cigar and continue, "But we'll lick him tomorrow, though." Because in the morning, Grant was going to attack the Confederates with the power of everything he had at his disposal and continue that attack until he had either killed, captured, or forced every single rebel to retreat southwards as fast as they could. When the sun came up that morning, Grant launches a counterattack along his entire line. At first, the surprised and disorganized Confederates put up little resistance. They're going to be falling back and trying to organize themselves into lines of battle, but eventually they will be able to meet the blue wave of soldiers, and the fighting would get just as intense as it was on the first day. But inch by inch, the Federal soldiers will continue to push the Confederates back, and by mid-afternoon, Union soldiers would again occupy the positions they had occupied at the start of the day prior. Now, to get there, they had to march past the gruesome sights of the first day's fighting, and all the friends that they had lost and the many wounded men they heard fleeing throughout the night, now laying there dead as well. James McPherson, in his book Ordeal by Fire, talks about what this was like for the Federal troops. He says this, quote, "A particularly unnerving sight to advancing Union troops was yesterday's casualties. Some wounded men had huddled together for warmth during the night. Many had died there, and others were in the last agonies as we passed," wrote one Northern soldier. "Their groans and cries were heartrending. The gory corpses lying all about us in every imaginable attitude and slain by an inconceivable variety of wounds were shocking to behold." End quote. The Quaker Union's success in the mounting additional losses from this second day of combat caused Beauregard to make the decision to retreat back to Corinth. And at around 2:30 p.m., he issues orders instructing his troops to do just that. Both sides were exhausted by the end of this fight, and when the rebels retire from the battlefield, Union forces will not pursue them. Grant will choose instead to let his guys rest and get them resupplied before continuing any further with combat. Many of the now victorious Federals would stop in their reclaimed camps and fall to the ground completely wiped out, beyond their limits of exhaustion. Truthfully, neither of the armies were in a position to continue fighting anyways. Both sides would have more than 1,700 guys killed and 8,000 wounded as a result of the Battle of Shiloh. And of the almost 17,000 wounded, over 2,000 of them would soon succumb to their wounds, bringing the total number of KIAs to around 5,500 men. James McPherson, in his book Battle Cry of Freedom, quotes a Confederate soldier talking about how he felt after the battle. And I don't think it's a stretch of the truth to say that his words could have been spoken by any man on that battlefield, north or south. He says this, quote, "God grant that I may never be the partaker in such scenes again. When released from this, I shall ever be an advocate of peace." End quote. Grant, though victorious, was vilified in the press after being caught unprepared at Pittsburgh Landing. Critics will call for him to be relieved of his command and dismissed from the Army. But Abraham Lincoln couldn't do that. He finally had a general that could win battles, and the last thing he wants to do is put his star quarterback on the bench. So Lincoln will defend Grant, and he'll say simply, "I can't spare this man. He fights." If you enjoyed listening to this episode, make sure you never miss new ones by subscribing to the show on your podcast app of choice. And if you want to help us out with growing the show and enable us to bring you better content and more of it, then Brett and I ask you leave us a 5-star rating and a review. They really go a long way in helping us out. Stay up to date with everything from America Fog of War by connecting with us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As always, Brett and I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay frosty.